So, ladies and gentlemen, let me just give a sort of a short welcome. I think this is a fantastic opportunity we have here. We have, of course, the Sino-American trade conflict going on in Asia. We have, of course, we had for a long time the South China Sea. We have a tension between Japan and South Korea. We have an economic slowdown globally at large. And also, we have East China Sea, not the Taiwan Straits. And now, most recently, of course, or recently, for 14 weeks now, we have had Hong Kong. And that puts a lot of emphasis on all actors in the region, not least, of course, China's strategic priorities here. Is there a change or a continuity? What will happen? What can we expect and what can we not expect? And Professor Chen from the National Cheng University, is one of the leading experts on this topic. So this is going to be a fantastic opportunity, I think, to get a regional insight into this very interesting problem. And after that, we will have Ambassador Lars Vargö to comment and give his sort of European view on this, or maybe Japanese view. I don't know how you want to take it. Then we will open up for questions after that. And I will stress that once more when we have the questions. But the Russians are coming, so don't... Yeah, I think. Yeah. So if you don't know who that is, that's Hsih Fredrik. So when we take the questions, I will ask you to stick to one question a person and identify yourself and ask a question. Don't lecture about anything. So we can have as many questions as possible. And if you have more than one question, feel free to ask in the next round. And I can be very strict on trying to keep it down, so we don't have one or two of the audience asking 10 or 15 questions. But with that, Professor Chen, I would like to give the floor to you and let you start. So, thank you.
Okay. Thanks for Dr. Swanström for his invitation, and I have this great opportunity to come to Sweden and share my personal perspective regarding China's strategic attitude with you and every audience here. And I would like to share a little experience when I first met when I first come to Sweden, because yesterday I went to Royal Palace in Drottningholm, the small island of there. I think that most of you have been visited there. And fantastically, there is a so-called Chinese pavilion over there. So since we come from Taiwan and we share same Chinese culture, so I would like to show what's the Swedish perspective concerning China, at least 200 years before. So I went to there. I saw it very fun, but not fun, but funny for us, for me as a Taiwanese, because in our way of life, it's not China in the Chinese pavilion. It's a Swedish perspective of China. So, of course, that's the old history, 200 years before. So it raised me the question before I start my presentation. What's the Swedish perspective concerning the contemporary China, the communist rule in China? Would that be also we fought into the same mistake that 200 years before that Swedish elites have made, that they create a false but imaginary China, and upon which they make decisions internationally or domestically to China affairs. So that's a small start before my presentation, and I would like to present my point of view with 5 parts. And first, I would like to present what's the Chinese People's Republic of China's core interest in the global power shifting process. And then I will introduce President Xi Jinping's roadmap for national rejuvenation and Chinese strategy to restore the so-called great power status. And then, of course, we shift to the PRC and the USA trade conflict, how the United States suppressed the rise in China. And then back to Sweden, how a middle power like Sweden in the independent bipolar world would like to take and decide their decisions. First, and there are 6 parts of so-called Chinese core interest that the Chinese published their so-called Chinese Peaceful Development White Paper and outline the so-called core interest. The first will be state sovereignty, and then the so-called national security, territorial integrity, national unification, that includes Taiwan, of course, and also Chinese political system established by PRC's constitution and the overall social stability, and the basic safeguard for ensuring substantial development of the political and the social, economic and the social development. So based on that, Chinese take measures to encounter with the foreign affairs. Of course, back to the 20th century, we saw a different China. When the People's Republic of China established this, got into power in 1949, and first priority will be safeguard the national security against, firstly, the United States, the so-called foreign invasion. And then since 1968, Soviet Union became the main target of Chinese threat. And then Chinese try to consolidate the Communist Party state system. That's the core interest in heritage to our nowadays. And of course, on the other hand, the Chinese People's Republic of China, of course, and try to isolate the Republic of China in Taiwan and try to get the sole representative of China in the global sovereign state society. And then in the 1980s, and then Chinese try to play a balancer, the role of balancer between the United States and the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And then in the 1990s, when the Cold War ended, the Chinese tried to engage and also in the so-called unipolar war, that United States supremacy will be marked in that age. However, in nowadays, time change, China's status change. And I would like to show you some statistics. First of all, that will be the United States National Intelligence Council, a review in 2012 that they focus the future of the great powers ranking, and then predict that at least in 2020 or later, no more than 2045, that People's Republic of China will suppress the declining United States of America as well as the EU, become the first and the only great power at that age. Okay, that's the 2012 forecast. And then, just a month ago, Japanese Center for Economic Research, they reviewed another report concerning what's the great power ranking in 1960. And then, of course, they maintained the forecast in 2012 that China might suppress the GDP of the United States in 2030. However, because of the Chinese population aging, as well the capability of innovation, Japanese scientists forecast that in 2060, the United States GDP might suppress again over China. So that means during 1930, 2030 to 2060, we might saw a great duel between two giants, economic giant, of course, United States and PRC. So that kind of focus reminds us what the Chinese core interest in nowadays. Kevin Root, the former Premier Minister of the Australian, published his review his perspective in 2018. He thought that the core interest, the most important core interest of Chinese People's Republic of China will be maintain the centrality of the Communist Party ruling in China, and then maintain a national unity, and then with strong economic growth, balancing protecting the environment, keeping border state under control, projecting China's maritime power, and leverage Chinese economic power across Asia, and then eventually the reform part of global system to be better suited to China's interest. That idea from Australian politician Kevin Root in 2018. So, academic research shows us already how the great power compete in what kind of patterns in the so-called great power shifting. Scholars argue that in a great power shifting process, emerging power would challenge the state-owned global institutions. And then emerging power will promote her interest and her status in a global society with her growing material capabilities. And then we will saw an intensifying conflict between the emerging power and the state-owned hegemony, and then eventually there will be a hegemony war, inevitable. So it's a very sad situation. But what, how, and the Chinese People's Republic of China government would like to suit, accommodate such kind of trends. President Xi Jinping declared in 2017 in Chinese Communist 19th National Congress. He provided a so-called roadmap of the Chinese national rejuvenation. And he declared that in the first stage will be 2020. That will be next year. And there will be, the Communist Party will build China to become a so-called moderately prosperous society. And 15 years later, till 2035, that China will become a socialist, modernized state, be intensified socialist. So socialist will be the core. Modernized will be the bypass, spill over Chinese development. And then in 2050, that will be the 100 years after the Chinese government, Chinese Communist Party got into power, that the China will become a so-called great state of socialist modernized country with first-class army. That will be the sole superpower in the world. So that's the Chinese perspective regarding itself and the future of the China. How? So how China try to realize such kind of roadmap of national rejuvenation? First, we noticed that China's goal is very clear, and the People's Republic of China endeavor to forge an unchallengeable great power status and promote China's national rejuvenation. And second, the strategy is so tangible. China devotes great effort to reshape the regional institution, and by enhancing economic interdependence, framing with which abundant economic interests might deter her economic partners to launch balancing strategy against China. And then we saw the initiative for so-called One Belt, One Road initiative, as well as the 16+1 initiative that Chinese launched to the Eastern European states. And they somehow got some kind of success. In Southeast Asia or even Central Asia states, these states try to take in a so-called hedging policy, not offend China, but also not to offend nobody. And then we saw also Russia try taking a rapprochement strategy and even enhance their military relationship with People's Republic. And that's the success or even the outcome of Chinese strategy to restore the Chinese great power status. And of course, we saw some counterbalance. The measures come from the United States. Of course, especially for Trump administration, in United States National Security Report, published in 2017 under Trump administration, the United States claimed and testified that they has already failed to transform China after decades of interaction based on trade, cultural, and political exchanges. That means the so-called liberal order cannot transform China from a dictator, authoritarian, or even communist regime to a liberal one, as we expected for at least 30 years before the 2001, when China joined the WTO. So, under such circumstances, United States identified China and Russia being a so-called revisionist state. They are actively compete against the United States and her allies across political, economic, and military arenas. And in general, the United States tried to maintain her unipolar status with measures to suppress China's rights, which might compromise her global predominance. And then, of course, in recent years, in the past years, we saw there was a so-called trade war between China and the United States. And the recent development, I think that would be very clear that the United States launched at least 4 waves of tariff increasing measures against China, and China also taking some retaliation measures against United States goods import to China. However, in general, that's a map shown by United States Peterson Institute. I think that will be very clear map to show what the real situation and what kind of measures United States and China taken respectively. First, we saw that Trump administration planned to push average tariffs on China above 24% till the end of this year. And then that will be covering 96.8% of all imports from China. That will be double the tariff, cover almost all range of Chinese goods. That's United States measures. And on the other hand, United States scholars saw also a very interesting ideas, because Chinese take revenge, of course, focus on United States goods import to China. And the tariff will raise at about 25.96%, equivalent to the United States have taken against Chinese goods. However, on the other hand, Chinese administrations downgrade the tariff to other goods import from countries except from the United States. That means we saw divergence policy, that they take measures against United States goods, but they open their market to the rest of the world. So that would be some kind of isolation policy. Isolate who? Isolate United States of America. And they try to get support from all corners of the world to support their attitude against the United States. Okay. In Beijing's eyes, United States was anxious to her hegemonic decline. That means, will United States be afraid of Chinese so that they take such kind of tariff increasing measures before it's too late? Or United States defined the United States PRC confrontation is a conflict between the dictator and liberal order. So there will be no type of way of life in nowadays. There will be a competing mode of way of life, not the Chinese style. So that's the second point I think that will be, I would like to raise your attention to this. And the Chinese scholars believe also that the United States is taking comprehensive countermeasures to suppress China's rise. And some Chinese scholars thought that the United States had taken some so-called preventive measures, of course, in terms of trade, before it's too late, before China suppressed the United States. And then the United States tried to stop China's economic development and the so-called national rejuvenation. That would be violate the so-called Chinese core interest. And then Chinese scholars regard that the trade war between the United States and the People's Republic of China will last for decades. So under such basement that they make their decision and they take their measures against the United States, and of course the measures to other countries, including Sweden, EU, and other Africa, Latin American countries, to deal with the new situation. And they are so confident. They believe that China is a rising power within the framework of the United States hegemony institutions. So United States suppression against China will trigger a global trade financial disorder adjustment process, and to which most major powers might be opposed to that, because we already enjoy a lot from the contemporary international trade financial institutions. Nobody wants to abandon that. The Chinese think that will be a very important thought. And the United States PRC is mutual interdependent. So both share some common interests in terms of global governance. So the winner of the economic duel cannot be decided in the short term. So the trade conflict, trade war will last for a long time. And Beijing try to frame in the nature of the United States and PRC confrontation into only to a scope of material interest dispute instead of the so-called ideological or cultural confrontation. And second, they claim that United States policy produce no winner but losers. So it's very hard for the United States to contain China's rise in an independent area. And then they were taking a firm attitude to United States economic crackdown, and they try to obtain support all around the world, saying that China is a victim of the United States economic burden. So, come to Sweden and all the countries, the rest of the world. With a rising power, pretend the state gold power, that China try to safeguard the contemporary international trade financial institutions. And on the other hand, United States, the hegemonic power, become a revisionist state in terms of global trade regime. Such is the total contradictory situation to the academic research. And then, regarding the distribution of global power, we saw the United States PRC geopolitical competition is intensified, not only in East Asia, but in Middle East, but also even in Europe. And the scope of United States and PRC competition extends from economic to financial, geopolitical, and the ideological sector. And hence, would the global market retreat from a globalized one into an inward-looking one? That's a great concern. We should pay much attention to that. And then what role that middle power could play in the current bipolar world, and what role that Swedish try to expect EU would play in the power shifting game. Okay, thanks for your attention, and I appreciate for your comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation, very interesting. There are many aspects of what you're saying that I would like to comment on, but I think it will take too much time from, I think all the people in the audience would also like to comment on what you're saying. I think as a basis for our discussion, I think it's also important to remember what China has gone through in history from the mid-19th century, when it really became the victim of European aggression, specifically British aggression. And then later on, other countries came in, and not least Japan. So whatever the outcome of the war between the communist forces and the Kuomintang forces, I think China is still developing out of that drama, or out of that, out of those difficulties. And I think it would be very, very hard to isolate history from what is happening today. Whether it's good or bad, that's another thing. If we don't remember history, I think it would be hard to see how the Chinese leaders are thinking. Then, of course, when it comes to the conflict between China and the United States, it is very easy for China to appeal to, for instance, to Swedish players and other European players when they are saying that we are trying to follow the international rules within the WTO, for instance. Because this is exactly what the Swedish government has been saying for years, that we have to follow international rules if we are to survive as a small country or a medium power country, or if the EU is going to have any influence in the world, the EU has to underline the importance of international rules. I think here the present president of the United States is really working in the interest of China. I think he are doing things that we think are simply wrong, and it's easy for the Chinese leaders just to take a step back and say, what did we tell you? So it's very, this is in a way also a golden opportunity, I think, for China and the Chinese leaders to create the friends that you mentioned that they are trying to create on the international arena, specifically when it comes to international trade. But then, of course, there are also conflicts coming out of our insistence on international rules, and that's specifically when it comes to the rule of law and human rights and so forth. But also, if you look at the Northeast Asia as a region, it is very hard for China to go beyond a certain point when it wants to reestablish itself as a power, regional power. Because whatever you say about Japan, about South Korea, even North Korea, these are countries that will not be bullied. They can take it to a certain extent, and then there will be a counterforce. So I think that also China realizes this, and finds that the only way out for the Chinese leadership is to have relatively good relations with China. So one question to you is that, do you think that at this point China has also an opportunity and will use an opportunity to create better relations with, for instance, Japan, because they have, if not a common enemy, but they have common problems created by the United States, and they can actually try to invite more. In a friendly way, Japan into an order, a regional order that is more in their interest than in the United States' interest. Coming back to your first introduction, going to the Chinese pavilion in the Drottningholm Castle area, I think that it's true that this was a very biased view of China. Of course, at that time, Sweden was a great importer of porcelain or china from China, and it was a sort of a boom, a Chinese boom in Sweden at that time. But if you turn it the other way around, today And I think that, as you also mentioned a little bit, we still have somehow a biased view of China. Definitely, we don't see the whole picture. We see certain aspects of the picture, but it's also true the other way around. I think that China, the Chinese leaders, perhaps even the other countries in the region, have a slightly biased view of Europe and our development. They think that for instance, when it comes to China, to Sweden, I think they ask themselves, how can the Social Democrats, how can they have managed to stay in power so long, although they are socialists, which maybe they're not, but to a certain extent perhaps. But there are certain views of our welfare system that I think is not perhaps correctly understood, and the problems that we have also. But it would be interesting to hear your view. What is your view of Sweden and the European Union, for instance? But there are many aspects that we can bring up. I just brought up a few, and it would be interesting to hear your comments on those.
So before, and I'm going to take questions then from the audience, but one of the things that you mentioned 16 plus 1, which is now turning into 17 plus 1 and 18 plus 1. And what is interesting, your take, what does that mean for Europe? Are we exaggerating the problem, or is it an opportunity? What is it? I mean, Europe is well, normally say there's as many views as European countries, but I think it's probably more complicated than that. So in addition to Lars' questions, I would like to ask that as well. And then I will take 3 questions at a time, so if you raise your hand, I will just write it down. So short questions later, and identify yourselves. So.
Okay. And first, Concerned Ambassador Lars, your comments, I'm grateful for your comments, and it also opened my mind to Swedish position to China. And also I think for the buyers problem, I think that's very interesting, because somehow that Chinese, I think that China has also some kind of buyers to the EU, to Sweden, or even to the United States of America. And because in general, Chinese thought that we have, as in my presentation, you might saw that Chinese prefer to take economic incentive to diverging the policies, diverging the camp, the so-called liberal camp. So that means that the Chinese thought that money can buy everything. Instead, of course, they are communists, they are materialists. So would that be true? But on the contrary, I think that Japanese empire made a mistake in 1941, because they saw that the United States is very weak, liberal order is so soft, and the strong Japan, or even in nowadays, the strong China can buy everything. But I don't think that would be true, because value is I think that would be solid part in the way of life in the liberal order. And if Chinese can understand the importance of the liberal order, the essential element of the liberal order, that would also, for them, that would be a misjudge, and also they would mistake, and eventually conflict might be the terrible outcome, and nobody will try to expect for. Yes. And also for the 16, 17, or even 18 plus 1. Yes, and for Chinese perspective, my attention that would be most of the they try to cooperate mostly with some country within the EU, that economic development, even democratic integration, or even some kind their believers on the human rights might be not so strong as the Nordic countries, or even German or France. So that perhaps they try to diversify the EU rather than really try to establish some kind of cooperation with the EU in general. And if they would like really take a comprehensive measures with EU, they could and should cooperate directly with the EU rather than establish bilateral or even semi-multilateral relationship with certain countries in the EU. So that would be a strategy, of course. That's my point of view. Okay.
I think, or else we're going to start back there. Yeah. Do we have maybe I'll take 3 questions and we'll rotate again.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Gabriel Johnson from Stockholm University, Korean Studies. My question is if the ongoing crisis in Hong Kong will have any impact on China's policies in the field you are talking about. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Van Lien. First of all, thank you for the very interesting presentation and for the initiative to invite Professor Chen here. I have a very short question. I was a bit, as the French say, j'ai resté sur mon faim, because you were going to talk about strategic priorities, and I think it was a lot about economics and the relationship with the United States, which is, I think, a very brief way of presenting the world. But you showed these graphs with economic power up to 2050. And I think the implicit assumption was that economic power has to do with political power, so, well, you just extrapolate and there you are. I just wanted to add one variable, which you didn't mention, but I think is important, that's demographics. China is a rapidly aging society. The dependency ratio is getting more and more unfavorable. That's already happening now. Just imagine what it would look like in another 30 years. I was just wondering whether you could add this variable into your projections. Thank you.
Marianne Lanazza, Lund University, in the think tank MENA.se. I would like to put a question about World Trade Organization, because China is, like European Union, very keen to keep on. But, as you know, the World Trade Organization didn't manage to go ahead after the Doha decisions and so on. So almost nothing have happened during the last 25 or 24 years. So how sustainable are the roles, especially when the US is playing on its own gain?
So, okay, we'll open up for a bit of replies. Actually, when it comes to the demographic here, also add to that, South Korea now has the lowest growth in the world. It's under reproduction. So, I mean, that also adds to this demographic. So,
Okay, I'll first answer to your question concerning Chinese demographic problem. And as I show in the map, index in that Japanese research, economic research they reviewed, they already account the factor of demography. So that assumed that in 2060, that the United States will surpass again the PRC in terms of the GDP, of course. So that will be the outlook of East Asian scholars posed to us nowadays. And also, to the WTO, I think that will be interesting because, as far as I know, that till the end of this year, the so-called dispute management settlement mechanism, yes, there will be no judge at all, only one judge, because of the United States veto. And so that we could say that the WTO and dispute settlement mechanism already being crippled because of United States policies. So that's the reason why China's claim they are safeguard WTO rather than United States. Thank you.
Lars, do you have anything there?
No.
Okay, we'll have 1, 2, and I have no more.
My name is Richard Hsih from Central. You were talking about Chinese strategic priorities. I am a little bit astonished that you have not taken up the question of Taiwan, because in Chinese policies it's coming up all the time. But my question is that from your talk, you put China and US all the time, one against each other, one parallel with each other. And you said that during the 40 coming years, China will even take the lead. Now, I'm thinking that if this is your thinking, your studies, how happened that Taiwan is not siding up with China, but instead is not siding up with China? Yes, and instead of that, you have in the Hong Kong protests siding up with Hong Kong and buying F-16 and so on. Thank you.
I'm Rutger Palmsson, and I'm a former sinologist and having been based at the Swedish Embassy in Beijing a long time ago. I am thinking of the Confucian Renaissance that is ongoing in China under the leadership of the Communist Party. You could say that turns on its head the principle of accountability that Francis Fukuyama insists is at the basis of the ability of Western states to mobilize society's resources. So here my question is, do you think that this will support or undermine the ability to mobilize society's resources in China for its international ambitions?
Yes, hello there. First of all, thank you for a very interesting presentation. Secondly, my name is Dag Helstenius, working with the Swedish Space Corporation. And my question would be, as you rightly point out, we see the conflict between the US, the emerging power China. We see China collaborating maybe a little bit more closer nowadays with Russians. How do you think that they will have a strategy and approach towards the other major power, India? Thank you.
So many questions. First, I will start with Taiwan. Yes, as I mentioned in Chinese co-interest, the compass already the so-called integration of territorial and sovereign rights. So there'll be no doubt for Chinese claim that Taiwan is part, as well as Hong Kong is part of People's Republic of China. So their policy is very clear. However, what the the Taiwanese people's reactions to that? I'm looking forward, that next year there will be a presidential election held in Taiwan. And to the ruling party as well as the opposing party, their presidential candidate gives at least their policy already to the mass of Taiwanese. So I think that Taiwanese will decide next year what will be our policy to China's unification claims. And second, could China mass mobilize their resources upon their people? I think perhaps somehow yes, because we saw already that Chinese Communist Party used the patriotism or even the nationalism already successfully mobilized the Chinese to take some, at least raise some economic competitiveness, Huawei, for example. And they got somehow success in the global market already. So under their estimation or even their plan, they really figures that they could successfully overpass the United States or even the rest of the world, not only in economic but also in technology innovation sectors. So that's the point I would like to raise your question. And secondly is India. Yeah. Yes, we understand, according to the demographic, that India might be the second largest superpower in at least 50 years later. But it's astonishing already because nobody talking about India, not in the United States nor in China. And because everybody show their interest to who will be the first one rather than who will be the second. So I think that Chinese saw they will be the first and they disregard the second. So that's somehow that's a bias, of course. So that, however, we saw another picture that when the great power chase for the superiority or even power supremacy over the rest of the world, the second is nothing. The number one will be the most important player in the world politics. Thanks for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Niklas Swanström. I have the same question as the gentleman there, but maybe I can ask another question. What do you say, Professor and Lars, if it's possible for China and other Northeast Asian country, they say the Nordic country as a good example, from the enemy to France, from the conflict to the peace, if it's possible for the Northeast Asian country, maybe about 10 or 20 years from now? Is my question.
Yes, I want to ask about the role of Russia. You didn't mention Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the deep relationship between Russia and China in this bipolar world order. I would like that you elaborate a little about that. What expectations could be?
Yes, thank you. I'm Tom Hart. I'm among the things at the Stockholm School of Economics and Asian Studies there. I have a general question which I maybe have a hard time formulating. But your presentation, which I found very interesting, was very much in terms of powers. You talk about power relationships and this concept of a middle power. I think I find this way of looking at things rather misleading, thinking about what's happening in the future. For instance, what is Germany? What is Germany? A middle power? It's an extremely successful country, but you don't think of it as a country anymore. It's now part of Europe. We have in the world growing integration of the world economy on a level never ever approached before, and also problems in transformation, necessary transformations, also on a world scale. And my feeling is, looking at this in terms of power competition, who's best, who's going to get first and so on, is very misleading. I mean, it's true that the American population is growing older, but inevitably in the next 3 or 4 or 5 decades, the population of every country in the world is going to get older. And the size of the productive group would be smaller and smaller in relation to old people and young people. So I think I'm just challenging a little bit. Maybe this is not the way to look at these problems. The problem is a global problem.
We saw in recent years, especially in this year, that Chinese cooperate more with Russian armies in terms of the military technology transfer, joint exercise, and even we saw the presence of Chinese POA Navy warship in the Nordic Sea under the end of joint ceremony of the Soviet Navy festival or something like that. So in the near future, and we could say that Chinese Navy already been the second or even the third largest in the worldwide, under, of course, ranking below the United States Navy. But in the future, that in the next 10 or even 20 years, that Chinese might establish compatible Navy forces, even equivalent or even larger forceful than the United States. So that China will be a world power in terms of Navy, space, or even the so-called electronic virtual world. So that the cooperation between China and Russia, I think that will be a major concern to Sweden's future. And as my personal perspective, I saw that will be the cunning Chinese Navy presence in the Baltic, in the North Sea, or even in the North Pole. And even Chinese nuclear submarine could take advantage like the Cold War, to submerge under the iceberg of the North Sea and enhance their so-called nuclear deterrence capability against the United States. So that would be for sure. Of course, such kind of capability also present a deterrence to United Kingdom, France, and Sweden too. So that will be the future if we look at the development of the Chinese Navy in recent years. And the second to, yes, misleading. Of course, I admit that will be some kind of mislead. Because I'm educated, I got my PhD in France and in Taiwan. We use the United textbook of the international relations to educate our descendants. So of course, I admit I might be misled by the United States discipline bias too. Unfortunately, Trump also misled by such kind of perspective, and they say that the reason why he take the so-called American First policy. American First policy is totally a policy based on the material power supremacy. Yes, thank you.
If I can just comment on the question about peace, and I think the question was peace in Northeast Asia, or the possibilities of integration of that. I think that somehow we think it's news when China and Russia, for instance, cooperate or get closer to each other. But in fact, they are neighbors. So I think it would be very unusual or very strange if they didn't seek cooperation in somehow. Not saying that all their aspects of cooperation is good-hearted. That would be perhaps an exaggeration. But we have to compare the present situation in East Asia with the earlier situation in East Asia, where you had one power, the United States, and you had another power, Japan, where we had one power, the Japanese power, seeking hegemony. I can't even pronounce that word now. Hegemony, and actually was thinking of using force in order to dominate the region. Today, it's absolutely impossible for Japan to even think of invading the Korean Peninsula or think of invading Shanghai. And vice versa, it's inconceivable, as I see it, that China would even think of using military force in taking the Senkaku Islands, even though they would like to. If they really wanted to do that, they should have done it a long time, or tried to do it a long time ago. The fact is that the military power of Japan today is enormous, and it works in the way that no one would really like to try to use aggression against Japan. The military capacity of South Korea is enormous. No one would, in his sound mind, would like to invade South Korea, even if North Korea is saying that they would do that. North Korea, in its military power, is enormous. You don't want to invade North Korea from any direction. That would be a catastrophe. And of course, no one would, in their sound mind, would try to invade China or Russia, for that matter. So you have a situation where the only opportunity, the only possibility is actually to start cooperating in various ways. The only possibility is to create some kind of peace regime, even if it takes time. Because when we say that, oh, look at that, they're building up their power, there are other powers that will counter that, I think. Leaving South China Sea aside, I don't know what's going to happen there, but I think perhaps it is a similar situation there, that it's just not possible. Because if one of the powers would do something, the United States would immediately be there, and wham, you would have an enormous conflict. And I think, or whatever their policies are, whatever their objectives are, it's just impossible to change the balance that you have now. You just have to cooperate somehow.
Yeah, I would like to go back for a moment to the title of your presentation, the strategic priorities, change or continuity. I said earlier that I think your idea of a bipolar world is a bit is not really mine. After all, I'm from Europe, so you can imagine. But just assume, for the sake of argument, that we're living in a bipolar world. So the way I interpret your thinking is that, we have two super tankers, each moving and at one point crossing each other, and then one gets ahead of the other, etc. That's a kind of continuity that I think certainly in Western democracies is a bit far-fetched, shall we say. I mean, we have a president of the United States who doesn't cease to surprise everybody, who is very capable of changing policies whenever and wherever it suits him. There are people who say that he tries to undo everything his predecessor does. But if you look at China, there is one party, and there is one leader, and from what I understand, the latest Congress has basically abolished any time limit on leadership. So if you continue to think in terms of the superpowers or the super tankers or whatever, you have, on the one hand, you have these countries that have these very annoying elections every 4 years, where you get new people, new priorities and all that. And then, at least the way it looks now, you have a one-party system in China. Possibly, as somebody pointed out, it's not unknown for Chinese leaders to reach the age of 90, so by the time 2050, Xi Jinping may still be there. So my question is, even if the party is still there, even if Xi Jinping is still there, is it conceivable that, over time there will be an evolution in priorities, or, to speak in your terms, change or continuity? Thank you.
I will repeat my question since I didn't receive an answer. Will the ongoing crisis in Hong Kong have any impact on China's policies in the fields you are talking about? That is my question.
Thank you, Anna Wieslander. My question is, do you think that China will become world leader as they have defined it earlier than 2050? Because we're now only entering 2020 and there's a huge battle going on, almost as if the hegemonic war has already started, sometimes you feel like. So there is a discrepancy there, I think, with the Western response towards China and the Chinese timetable. If you have any reflections on that.
First, I would like to answer your question concerning Hong Kong. As I mentioned that, from my perspective, because my topic will be China's strategy, continuity, and as well the challenge. And if we take the example of what happened in 1989, we saw internal turmoils labeled by the Chinese Communist Party will have no huge influence concerning China's global status in the worldwide. So, of course, everybody concerned how the Chinese Communist Party rule the Chinese people. But in fact, that we talk too much and do less. So Chinese at least Communist Party don't afraid of that. Yeah, and they can do what they decide to do. Because 20 or even 30 years experience have already shown that Western society can do nothing to change their policy if they insist on to do that. And secondly, to the Chinese world leader status, I would like to mention that I use the word great power, not leader. Leader means that he has leadership and he could lead everyone, at least every world, every state of the world, a member of the global society, to march for at least a common goal under acceptable institution, setting the regulations accountable or even favorable to everybody's interest. But could China have possessed such kind of capabilities to lead the world? I truly doubt that, because till now they seek the status, but the great power, but they did not seek the status of global leader. So in the past long time, that I don't think they prepare for that status. And they benefit a lot from the state-owned institution already. They post their future of the so-called national rejuvenation, but that they did not provide us a roadmap concerning what the world would be under the, so when the day comes that China becomes the first great power in the world. Yes, thank you.
Just to actually, when you talk about Hong Kong, I do think it will have a bigger impact than before. And the reason is that China is more interdependent. China is much more integrated. So when we see this, we have economic downturn in China, but also globally, the consequences can actually be triggered. And we can have those unforeseen events that if it is a heavy crackdown, the international community will react. That will hurt the economy. And already now, when we have a China under 6% growth, which is, from a European point of view, very high, but so I think it definitely will be felt. And of course, we have an election in Taiwan coming up in January, as you mentioned. If that will be going against Beijing's interest, that will also have a consequence. So I understand exactly, and I think you're right, but I think it's slightly adjusted because the government in Beijing is more dependent both on public support as well as international engagement. So that's, I think it is a change from before. I'm not sure it's actually going to matter, but I think it is. It is it's a change coming up.
Yes, and of course, public support composed of the basic foundation for Chinese Communist Party ruling in nowadays. So how we define the so-called public? The public would be the 30 million Chinese people under communist ruling, or 600 million Hong Kongese under the so-called special treatment, or the international society. And as I mentioned, that Chinese Communist Party pay much attention to the so-called Chinese people. Say they use the nationalism or even the patriotism as a tool to mobilize or integrate the Chinese people under and satisfy with the so-called Chinese ruling, communist ruling, because the Communist Party provide wealthy, prosperity, blah blah blah, etc., etc., etc. And of course, and also, the Communist Party provide a picture away from the old imperialism invasion days. And the Hong Kong events raised somehow, as the Chinese Communist Party tried to use that to raise again that Hong Kong is a taboo, that old days Chinese invasion, even Chinese humiliation under the so-called Western imperialism invasions. So what's the public? For Western society, maybe a lot of countries concerned what had happened and how the Chinese Communist Party treat and manage the situation in Hong Kong. But for the Communist Party, I think they have another perspective, problem and issues to consider for their ruling, or even the stability, or even constellation of their ruling basis. And till nowadays, we saw that Chinese take a very prudent attitude, and they let the Hong Kongese government to deal with the problem by themselves, and they take a long distance away from that. I think that that's the lesson what the Communist Party learned from the 1989 incidents. Yes, thank you.
I'm the first. It's on.
Well, I have a question. On your seminar, you have been talking about the trade war between, or trade conflict between the US and China. And one of the sentences that you mentioned, that you say that this could last for decades. Mm-hmm. Many people in the literature, in media and so on, think that the trade war is really closely connected with Mr. Trump. So when he will disappear, the whole thing will disappear. And people say, we just wait. We don't even know if he will be re-elected next year. So my question is that can you comment why you do say for decades when currently Trump has been president only for a few years?
Do you hear me? Yeah. I just thought suddenly Iran hasn't been mentioned, a big player historically, and has China, or is China going to change its policies towards Iran? Iran.
Take the gentleman in the corner.
Yes, my question is, do we need a new world leader? Maybe not. I think we need to together looking for the solutions on the common challenges the human being facing for. I think maybe the Chinese philosophy about Tianxiaism can be a good idea or not. What do you say?
Tianxia is a phrase that Chinese try to use to accommodate the so-called global society. But however, if we take a research on the inherent element of the so-called Tianxia, Tianxia is a hierarchical structure rather than an equal structure among the members. So that means Tianxia means everyone subordinated under Chinese ruling. Would you like to accept that? No. In sovereign states, nobody would try to be under so-called what kind of Tianxia. I don't think so. So that's the reason why the Chinese government rarely use the term Tianxia in recent years. That some Chinese scholars like to use the term Tianxia, but Chinese government never used the term the Tianxia or even tribute system to provide a picture of the near future if China becomes a so-called global superpower in the world. That's my personal perspective. And concerning Iran, I really am not an expert to the Middle East province, but as far as my knowledge, that Chinese followed what the EU would take to the Iran's nuclear events. They support the United Nations solution, and they support that Iran will follow Jacob agreement and so on and so forth. Yes, that's new knowledge I can count on. I'm so sorry for that. And any question?
Do you have anything? Not really, no. Of course, the Tianxia concept is a Confucian concept, I think, and the question is whether that there's a relationship. And when it comes to Confucianism and it's whether it's alive in Korea, in China, and so forth, I think even if it would be, I think it's very different from the old Confucianism. It's not really a force in itself.
Well, I had another question about resource mobilization, but I think this is quite interesting as well. The Tianxia concept, I think, also requires a Tianzi. Yes, exactly. And I think that complicates its international usage. But meantime, according to the 5 elements theory, you have everything in 5s in China, from banquets to relationships, including directions. You have east, west, south, north. But you also have the middle. And you have the Middle Kingdom. So does that have an impact on the way China sees the world?
That question?
Yeah, we'll take that. I see no other hands. So
Okay. If we're back to the old days, every civilization regard themselves to be the center of the world. Roman did that. Egyptian did that. Chinese did that. And I don't know where Swedish did that too. In the old days, you will be the center of the world and the rest. Yes, because the earth is round. We are not in a flat world. We are. So
Here we have the Westphalian order.
yes, that the Chinese do not agree with that because that's the Westphalian world. Yes, they try to be a new world order that everyone be equal. Of course, Chinese will be equal among the equals. Okay. So I don't think that the centrality will. Of course, it play a historical impact to Chinese policy, of course. And but as I mentioned, that in the old days, everyone believed they are the center of the world, and the rest of the world will be barbarians and nothing there. So. Of course, that's tricky because the Chinese leader Xi Jinping mentioned several times they try to restore Chinese great power status and so-called national rejuvenations. So if we really put China back into the old days, that would be the center of the world, of course. And the rest will be barbarians. Like it depends on Chinese silk, China, and high-tech knowledge products. And then contribute your material to Chinese for the sake of your life. That's the old days of Chinese civilization imagined in the tribute system. But of course, in nowadays, it's totally untrue because we are in an independent world, and everyone contribute this knowledge and skills all together to develop the world never imagined even 200 years before could get. So I think that also I think that would be the Chinese government should think about what kind, and also that there will be their mission and even duty to apply and provide a plan, roadmap plan, not only to Chinese people but also to the world, how the Chinese would provide to the world for their prosperity, for their welfare, or even for their benefits, and I think that they should answer that such kind of question, and also I expect Swedish people to pose such kind of question to Beijing. Yes, thank you.
Actually, it came out a question also there if Trump was the reason for this, and I see in your face that you agree with me. I don't think Trump is the reason. I think it's even if we have a new leader, and I think actually Trump will win, but that's not a story. We're now in a different area. But Europe had a problem with China, transparency and the way we did trade, the tariffs, the unfair treatment, all of this. There's been and then of course we have the differences when it comes to values. And maybe Europe hasn't been that explicit about our values. We have been explicit, but we haven't followed it up with strong policies. United States has been much more clear on that. So from my perspective, it's this is a continuation. But that will also change, of course. I mean, we will change, China will change, and all of this. I mean, so how you see it, and the same with the relations between China and Russia. I don't see this as a very long-term stable relationship because Russia means less for China over time, and other relationship is more valuable. So how do you see this over time, and how do you see this changing? Which direction are we heading? when you see this trajectory is going straight up in one direction, I'm very skeptical. That's never going to happen. So what is your take on that, sort of a more sort of long-term holistic perspective, even if I don't like the word holistic?
And before I answer your question and all the questions raised by your lovely audience, and I think that I have to have your attention is that in the past 3 decades, we, at least Taiwan, or even United States, or even European countries, we made a huge mistake. The mistake is that we can change China by putting China into the so-called international institutions in terms of trade, financial, even human rights standards. But 30 years passed already, and Trump administration honestly admit that they, at least the United States, failed to transform China. And I do remember when I was young, at least 30 years before, that we believed our teacher told us liberal order will prevail. Authoritarian or even communist region were perished in that Fukuyama said. 30 years. However, he changed his attitude already in nowadays. So several times when I become a teacher or professor in Taiwan's National Cheng University, I remind us never to make such kind of mistake again. Because what our perceive, what our decision, or what our evaluation made turn our state into a direction that have no chance to recompensate the fault we have committed. So I cannot, like others, to predict what kind of China will fail or win or not. But I can say that according to the contemporary information I got, Chinese Communist Party really successfully stand against the so-called Western liberal invasion or poison, and they established a truly authoritarian regime under communist one-party ruling. And the popular support from the mass of Chinese people is truly real, solid. And they account on that too, of course. So I think that will be the great power we faced. It's not a great power in the Maoist days that is great, but it's not strong. It's big, but it's fragile. But nowadays, it's really the size of China is so huge, and its capabilities is so important, and its influence is immense. So perhaps I did not answer your question.
No, I mean, I don't think there is an answer. But I know, though, in a sense, that's also what I'm sort of looking for, because there's often a deterministic trend, which I think it's not, because there's sort of this black box we're muddling through, and we're trying to figure out ways to come out. And China is changing, not always to the better, but sometimes much to the better, and it's going. But that also goes to alliances and all that. I don't think it's going to be that static. I think we're going to see a much more opportunistic foreign policy, not only from China, but maybe also from Europe and United States and all that. I mean, United States is already maybe opportunistic, but that's another story. We're under Trump. But that said, I think we have to cut it short. We actually had more questions this time than I think we had in a lot of seminars, which I'm extremely grateful for. It's been very interesting to have both of your opinions, and hopefully we'll have many more opportunities to tap into this. And of course, we have January will be put even more emphasis maybe on Taiwan and see what comes out and what kind of implications that will have, because I think this will be have a tremendous impact on the domestic policy of the mainland. So with that, well, thank you very much, sir, and it's been a great opportunity to have you here, so thank you.